Do you ever feel like it's harder to see the people who live near you than it is the ones who live far away? I mean, if you have relatives who live 5 states away, you have to do a lot of planning to go visit them. You have to take time off work, you have to map your route, you have to pay for gas and hotel. It's an ordeal to go far away. But I know for me, sometimes I do a better job of spending time with those who are far away than I do with those who live 2 miles from me. Sure, I might run into them at the grocery store, but how often do I leave a conversation saying, "Hey, we should do dinner," and then it hardly ever happens? Please tell me I'm not the only one this happens to. Sometimes I think it's harder to go to people who are close to us than it is to those who are far away. Or thinking about it in a slightly different way, we love to plan for the extraordinary, but what would it look like to pay attention to the ordinary? Today we are asking the question, how do we go where Jesus leads? We've been talking about following Jesus here, there, and everywhere, and if we're going to do that, what examples in the Bible can we look to about going where Jesus leads? I think sometimes we look at figures in religious history and we think that being a true follower of Jesus means we need to take drastic measures. We hold the belief sometimes that there's a prescription for Jesus followers. You have to give up your belongings and then you'll be the right kind of follower. Or maybe we think there's one certain type of worship style we have to follow in order to authentically follow Jesus. Or think about prayer. I was with a group of kids recently and we talked about praying out loud, and some of them were really scared to try it because they felt like they needed beautifully worded prayers. They had blocked the idea that their ordinary words could even do the same thing that the prayers we read that were written centuries ago. In the Bible, much of the New Testament is written by this guy named Paul. In his early life, he actually persecuted Jesus' followers, but he eventually has an experience that leads him to preach and teach about Jesus. And he travels all over the place to do this. He wrote letters to new Christians, helping them interpret Jesus' teachings. Paul was one example of someone who took seriously the idea of going to follow where Jesus leads. And in the book of Acts in the Bible, we get a glimpse of something we can all take to heart when we think about going where Jesus leads ourselves. In Acts chapter 17, Paul arrives in the city of Athens. Now, Athens is one of the oldest cities in the world. It's in the country we know as Greece. And Athens itself was a place where intellectual people lived and taught and came into their own. When you think about names like Plato or Aristotle, you can think about Athens. And this is a foreign land for Paul. I mentioned that he had been traveling all over to tell people about Jesus, and he wasn't with his Jewish people in Athens. There wasn't a Bible like we have now that Paul could somehow simply hand over for a reference point. Nothing was written about Jesus in this way. The messages about Jesus had to be relayed through teaching and conversation and relationship. And in this part of Acts, we get a glimpse of Paul having some of those conversations. We see that Paul is going to where the people are to do this, not only in religious places, but in everyday places, like the marketplace, as it says in verse 17. And at some point, you'd expect from any of us who are receiving new information, we hear in verse 18, I love the way this reports, "What is this babbler even trying to say?" the person says. "Come on, Paul, do a better job of explaining this to us. We're curious. So help us understand what you're trying to say about this guy named Jesus." So Paul goes to a place called the Areopagus. It's an actual place in Athens. It's a fun place to say, where the god Ares was said to have stood trial for the murder of Poseidon's son. It was a place where matters of religion or morality were often discussed. And Paul points out that they are very religious people, these people he's speaking to. They had built temples and altars to all sorts of different gods for different reasons. They even built one to an unknown god, presumably to cover all the other things. It was kind of like a just-in-case altar. But Paul, he teaches them that the God whose son was Jesus, that God isn't bound by a certain type of altar. Paul says we shouldn't even think that God is like gold or silver or stone. God is not an image made by human design. God is in creation. God's around us in the birds and the flowers. God is no doubt extraordinary, but God is found in the ordinary. No special altar, no special words, no special prayer needed. So today, I invite you to read Acts 17 and to think about the ways that you can go where God leads. It doesn't have to be far. It doesn't have to be extraordinary. It doesn't have to be an adventure. And that might be harder, no doubt. But ultimately, it could be pretty powerful too.